Hello, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 156, an interview with Ronald Royer. Hi, welcome back to the Flute 360 podcast. These next 4 episodes, we are going to talk with 4 extraordinary composers in episodes 154 through 157. A little background information: these 4 musicians and I made contact through the Ultimate Music Business Summit hosted by Dr. Garrett Hope in January of 2021. Because of this event, I was able to make some wonderful music connections that have evolved into new friendships. This composer series brings me much joy because I get to share my new music friends with you. Learn from these aspiring musicians who give you gold nuggets that you can implement today. We talk about their flute compositions, how they perceive the flute voice, recording studio tips, and how to navigate a music career in our current climate. Lastly, I'd like to direct your attention to 2 great incentives that are going on right now. Flutistry Boston is giving you a 20% discount off of the book Survival of the Flutist by Marian Gedigian from now until March 31st, 2021. Use your Flute 360 code today to receive your discount. Lastly, Elizabeth Talbert is giving you a 20% discount off of her book, Applied Flute Practice Technique, from now until May 7th, 2021, when you use your Flute 360 code. Both links are provided in the show notes below. I would like to note that your purchase helps to support the Flute 360 podcast. If you would like to contribute to the podcast, this is a great way to do so. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Flute 360 podcast episode. As you know, we are in the middle of a composer series. So a few years ago, I did a wonderful composer series where we got to highlight and talk with fantastic musicians across the country. And because it was so popular, we have brought it back. So we are in March 2021, and I get to talk with 4 to 5 amazing composers at the global level, not just in the States, but I am here today with an American/Canadian composer, Ron Royer, and he and I have become great friends since meeting at the Ultimate Music Business Summit a few months ago, hosted by Dr. Garrett Hope. So I'm so glad that our worlds have collided, and today we get to pick his brain about his compositions, his compositional process, being a cellist, working with flutists, and the list goes on and on. So enjoy, and without further ado, welcome Ron.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said earlier in our small chat, we had the pleasure of talking last night, and now we're talking this afternoon. And I'm just so stoked with all of the amazing projects that are unfolding for us.
I'm really excited too. I'm so happy to have met you, and I'm really looking forward to collaborating on a few different projects now.
Yeah, I can't wait to see how it all unfolds, and it's going to be super fun.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we're going to sit down and have some fun here where I get to pick your brain. Before we talk about all of those different topics, I think it's good to get a foundation laid. Can you share with the audience who you are, your musical background, anything that you would like to share?
Well, first of all, I was born in Los Angeles. And I come from a family of professional musicians on my mother's side. So my mother, Virginia Royer, was a pianist. Her sister, Louise DiTullio, just recently retired. She was a professional flutist for over 50 years. She joined the Los Angeles Philharmonic when she was only 19. And then after several years in the orchestra, she went into the studios and was one of the top studio musicians. She recorded over 1,200 movie scores, as well as tons of TV work, recording work. She did the Oscars every year for I don't know how many decades. So a wonderful career. So I have a very special affinity for the flutes. I want to say that right up front. And my grandfather was a cellist, and they had a trio: flute, cello, piano. So I grew up hearing the flute from the time I was born. They would regularly, the trio would rehearse at our house, and I would go to bed hearing this amazing music. So these instruments, and obviously these people were really important to me. So we're very close as a family, and the music was amazing. And besides the three of them, also had two more uncles who were professional cellists, another uncle, a violinist, two uncles who were professional horn players, another uncle who was an oboe player and a pianist, and it goes on. So lots of music, not surprising. It rubbed off on me. By the time I'm a cellist, by the time I was 16, I decided that I wanted music to be my livelihood and my life. I'm very thankful that I've been able to spend my career and life in music.
Very well said. Yeah, it's amazing to see how those influences, especially family, can really shape you as a person and what you pursue, for your career.
Absolutely. And my family, they really had the passion and the love. They really, truly loved music. And so besides hearing all the music in my life, every family party, we bring everyone together, they're always talking about music and every aspect, the musical side, the business side. And I would hear these great stories because they worked with all the top musicians who were in Los Angeles. So they knew Stravinsky well, recorded with him, did live concerts with him. They knew Schoenberg well. My grandfather and my uncle actually went and played Schoenberg's chamber music in his house. So I am, again, fascinating. Another uncle studied with Schoenberg in university, all his courses that he taught, counterpoint, harmony, composition, analysis, the whole works. And as well as all the great film composers. And there's just so many amazing musicians, and especially during World War II, where that became the kind of the cultural center of the world. It was amazing who was working and living in Los Angeles at that point, and my family were in the thick of it, and they got to get to know and work with all these amazing musicians, and so that really rubbed off. I loved hearing these stories about all their musical experiences and hearing firsthand about all these amazing composers and musicians. So that was really inspiring to me.
Yeah, it's like history coming to life. From my perspective, you read about Schoenberg, right? And Bernstein and all of the greats in books. But then when you have this family history, especially yours coming from this music lineage, and these stories are passed down, it's like as if it happened yesterday. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, it really is. And it puts things in context. So, for example, with Arnold Schoenberg, he lived in a little house and he had heavy drapes and he was a chain smoker and he was by nature a rather uptight, nervous kind of person. So you go into the house and you're just this dark, smoky, and you feel the tension. And all of a sudden, all the music, the 12 tone, all the musical aesthetic, it all makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Even before you said the 12 tone, naturally, when you were saying the dark with the shades and the chain smoking, it's like, well, now all of his music makes sense to me because it actually encapsulates that whole mood and feel. So that is so neat.
Yeah, and certainly hearing about all these great composers made me interested in one, like, how do they do it? What's the and I realized that the best way to try to understand how music's put together is by trying to compose yourself. So from even though I didn't start to compose until I was 30, but it was something I was always really interested in and thought about.
Yeah, completely. I talked with a composer last week, Pamela Sklar, and she said the same thing. You know, the more she composes, the more she understands her instrument better on a whole different level.
I totally agree. And I should mention Pam is a friend of my wife and I. So it's a small world.
Wow.
But I totally agree. And I think it's a really interesting thing. If you look at pre-World War II, studying composition was part of any musician's training. So we know, I mean, all the great performers, whether it was a flutist, a cellist, a pianist, I mean, they all composed for their instrument because that was this. And even if you weren't interested in composing, you still studied composition because it really gives you a really deep understanding of how music's put together and really informs the way you interpret, how you phrase the music. So I'm a big proponent of teaching. And it's interesting that after World War II, we kind of put music education in kind of silos. So you're a performer, you're a composer, you're a conductor, and you focus on that. And now, you know, the turn of the 21st century, that's changing again, where we're starting to realize, you know what, creativity, studying creativity is really important. And so we're now more and more you're getting in university improvisation classes, students learning how to compose and arrange, and I think that's a really positive thing. And then certainly I with my students the same thing. Even if they're don't want to be composers, I really encourage them to do some composition.
Yeah, and not just being a better performer, you know, composing your own pieces, but being exposed to all of these different areas is going to make you a better teacher or make you a better whatever your niche is, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And player, and especially for young players coming up, just the nature of the business. You know, maybe you don't want to be a composer, but if you want to be a professional flutist, being able to have enough skills that you could do arrangements and say, hey, here's, I want to arrange this piece for my instrument or an ensemble. That's a really useful skill that could really bring benefits to your career. So anyway, that's my recommendation.
No, that's great. I love it. So going back to your family, and you mentioned that being a young boy and then growing up in music and flute was always around you. I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but it piggybacks off of this nicely. And that is, how do you perceive the flute? I mean, from a cellist's perspective and from a composer's perspective, I would love to know how you perceive the instrument, and just because we have a flute audience.
Right. Well, composing for the flute for me feels very natural because like I said, from virtually the day I was born, I was hearing the flute played, and you get that sound in your ear, and you hear you hear what the flute could do, and you hear that sound, and so it's very meaningful for me. And I'd like to say that anytime I'm commissioned to write for a particular instrument, one thing I like to do is I like to listen to a lot of music by that instrument. So if I write for the oboe or for the French horn or whatever instrument, I'll start listening to recordings just to get that sound in my ear. And because for me, it's very important if I'm writing for an instrument that I want to write idiomatically and really bring out the different colors and sounds and that the instrument can do. And so anyway, so for me, I love the sound of the flute. It's an amazing instrument, as well as other flutes, piccolo, alto flute, bass flute. My aunt would play all those instruments regularly in the studios and in concert. She would always have a set of short pieces to share with the audience the different instruments. So I love them all.
Nice. Very cool. So when did you probably have said this, and I'm sorry if I've missed it, but can you talk about when composition started coming up in your life, and how did you go from being a cellist and composer and all of that?
Absolutely. Well, I'll continue with my story. Then I started off, grew up in this musical family. By 16, I decided I wanted to be a cellist, taking after my grandfather. And I went to university. And then when I got out of university, I was lucky. I started getting called to do various gigs in Los Angeles. So I started my career as a freelance musician, doing all kinds of music. Of course, classical music, playing in orchestras, doing some ballet, some opera, chamber music, solos. But I also got to work in the studios doing soundtracks for movies and TV shows. I got to do the Grammys. And that was a lot of fun. And I really enjoyed the variety of the different types of music I was playing. And then a big thing happened to me is when my father never liked to travel, and that was fine growing up. But when I started working, I decided I really wanted to see Europe. So my friend and I applied to go to a music festival in Siena, Italy. And that was a big deal. And then at that festival, I ended up meeting my wife, Kay, and a clarinetist, and we met there. And actually, that's where I met Pam Sklar. She was at the festival too, and we all became friends. But Kay and I really clicked, and we stayed in touch. After the festival, we had a 3-year relationship, and then we got married. And after a lot of discussions, we ended up deciding we would start our marriage in Canada. And long story made short, I started having some hand and arm troubles, which is very typical, overuse. And it's a long story, but very common among musicians. And it really caused me to kind of rethink that in some other situations, really rethink my life. And I realized as much as I enjoyed playing the cello, that my perspective on music was that I really I love music, and I really wanted to continue experiencing different music from different perspectives. So like I said, I enjoyed playing different types of music, but then, I'd always thought about composing, but, growing up, being busy as a cellist and practicing and performing, and I love playing in orchestras and school and all that, there just wasn't time. So at this point, I kind of rethought my life and decided that there was a need for, at that point in the Toronto board, there were some terrific music programs, and there was a need for string teachers. And I thought, well, this would be kind of fun because they have orchestra programs and enable to do, real serious rep. So I in worrying about my physical side of continuing the cello playing. So I ended up going to the musicians clinic, but it took a while to get accepted. It was brand new, but they ultimately fixed me up, which was great. But I went to teachers college, and I was offered a job right out of school, and in a program that had a really strong orchestra program where they could play the original versions of, Beethoven, and we did Enigma variations and, Capriccio Espagnole and all these great pieces. And it was really, so that was really exciting, because something else I was always interested in. So I had to learn how to conduct and to work with this type of program. And also, and when you become a teacher, you have your summers off, you have, you do have some vacation time. So then I started to compose, because it just came to the point where I said, this is an experience I really want to have in my life. I don't know if I'll be any good at it, but I want to try it. So I started to compose, and I loved it. I just to this day, I just really enjoy that. So my life really diversified. So at that point, I was busy as a teacher, conductor, composer. I still played some cello, but that kind of took a bit of a backseat. And, I've really loved that diversity. And for me, it's really kept me fresh. So even though I've been doing music now for, working for 40 years, I still feel as excited and passionate about it as when I started my career. So, and that makes me happy. I'm glad that I still have that love and passion for music.
No, that's great. And thank you for being so candid and open about the hand-arm injury. Unfortunately, the statistics are staggering with musicians who face some sort of performance-related injury. I think right now it's like over 80% of musicians at some point find themselves in that situation. And you're right. It makes you really take a step back and evaluate what's going on, what opportunities are there, what can you do with the current situation. And it's good to reflect and check the inventory and see what's going on. But it's kind of like a bowling alley, right? With the bumper guards. You know, your ball's going down the lane, but then life might take a turn that you weren't expecting and the ball hits the bumper, right? The rubber on the side, and then it shoots you off in a different direction. And so, no, that's good. It's good to be open to new opportunities.
Yes. And anyone, if anyone's listening who having any issues, go online. I mean, we've learned so much about musician injuries, and if you catch them early enough, you know, virtually everything is fixable or manageable. And luckily, in my case, I caught it fairly early, so it hasn't been a problem throughout my life. But if you kind of say, "Oh, it's not a problem," you ignore it, or that's where if you leave it long enough, it becomes chronic, and then you could have real permanent damage. So don't be afraid. It's like you say, very common. So find help.
Yeah, for sure. And I will plug this episode number in now because it is on the top of my head. I can't recall it. I did an interview with Dr. Susan Fain, and she happens to be episode number 1. So if you need some exercises or things like that from a practicing physical therapist, she's an expert in the field. And so I highly recommend that content. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. It's good to have those resources.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's good to have friends and share, because, the more you talk, the more you realize these are all common things that all of us, or so many of us have to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. Neat. So going back to your musical world, since we're talking about composing today, would you like to share your compositional process and how you approach a commission, or what would you like to talk about in this realm?
That would be fine.
Okay.
It's very interesting being a composer at present because there's so many styles and techniques that are open and available to us. So if you look at what's being composed in the quote unquote classical music vein around the world, you see this wonderful diversity, which I think is great, and everything from composers writing more experimental music to writing very accessible tonal music, melodic music, all kinds of influences, world music, pop music, jazz, you name it, are influences. And so that's a really good thing. And all of it's, encouraged, and you're seeing this happen. But as a composer, on the other side, it can be a little bit overwhelming because you have so many quote unquote tools in the toolbox now. It's it could be a little challenging to decide which way to go with things. So for me, a really important step is usually most of my music is commissioned, and I'm very thankful for that. And I love to collaborate. So I really get inspired by working on a specific project. So if someone comes to me and they say, "Oh, well, will you write a flute piece?" And then we have a conversation. Okay, what are you looking for? What kind of, and I like to try to bring out the kind of the musicality that each person brings the music, and that kind of helps narrow things down. And we'll discuss what are some of the musical influences you would like to hear in this piece, and all those things help narrow it down. So then once I have a concept, then I could start looking, finding the right notes, so to speak, for that. And I think all my experiences growing up as a cellist has really impacted my composition. And because I'm so used to hearing acoustic instruments, I still like to compose at the piano or the cello and sit down and come up with ideas and put those initial ideas on, pencil and paper. And then I will move on to the computer. And of course, the computer is a great tool. But it's just, for me, I'm really inspired working on an acoustic instrument versus working on a computer and then hearing, the more electronic sounds.
Yeah, for sure. Sometimes the MIDI sounds can be, or can throw you off a little bit.
Well, and that's, and that's a real issue that especially young composers have to deal with, because you sit down on your computer and and by nature, you're going to write music that's going to sound good on the computer. And if you're writing an orchestra piece, you have to be really careful, because you write it on the computer and it sounds amazing. And then you hand out the music to the orchestra and all of a sudden it's not working so well. And you go, and I've heard young composers, but it sounded so good on the computer.
Huh.
Well, a computer is not a live orchestra, and a live orchestra is not a computer. So, a good composer knows this. If they're writing for an orchestra, you're writing one way. If you're writing on the computer and using sample sounds and all that, which, many times they will use in commercial music, film scores now, and TV, you'll write to make the music sound good on the computer. So it's a different way of looking, and you have to be very cognizant of this.
For sure. Yeah, so speaking of orchestras, you have a neat little story that you want to share with us today. I don't want to go down too much down a rabbit hole, but you were sharing this story with me last night, and I thought the Flute listeners would just love it, about the piccoloist Anne Bernstein.
Yes. Well, a little setup was here in Toronto, the French flutist Patrick Gallois and Canadian cellist Shauna Ralston went to a performance here in Toronto of my cello concerto. And it just at this time, they were booking concerts for the two of them to play, and they were interested in some double concertos. So they ended up starting off by inviting three composers to write a double concerto for flute and cello. And I was one of these. They heard this concerto, they really liked it. So they said, would you, be interested in writing us a double concerto? And I said, absolutely. One, they're both amazing musicians, but also the idea of two instruments that are very close to me, the flute and the cello. I was like, yes, I'm so into this. So anyway, I got the commission. The premiere was in Finland, which was really exciting, because Patrick was also conducts, and he was conductor with the Sinfonia Finlandia at this time. And then just spending time when we're in Finland, and we ended up spending, going out to meals and spending a lot of time. Patrick is wonderful person, but he could tell great stories about his career. So one story that I just thought was really funny. He started his career as principal flute of the Orchestre National de France. And one of their regular guest conductors was Bernstein. And so this one concert, as you know, usually principal flute, you just play flute. But in this one piece that was programmed, the first flute had to also play the piccolo. So he thought, okay, well, it's just the one piece, and I don't need to bring my little stand to switch. I'll just put the flute on my lap, and I'll keep the piccolo when I'm not playing it in my front pocket of my tails. And when it's time, I'll just pull it out, play it, put it back, and it'll all be very easy. So that's what he thought. Worked fine in rehearsals, but when he went to the concert and he had his tails on, he put his piccolo in, he starts playing the piece and the flute, and then it's time to switch instruments, and he goes to grab his piccolo and it's not there. And he's going, what the heck? I'm sure I put my piccolo in my front pocket. And he starts patting down his coat, like, where did it go? And he puts his fingers in, and he feels there's a hole in the front pocket. Oh no. So now he's patting himself trying to find the piccolo, and Bernstein's looking at him and go, what's going on? Like, what, he's just really perplexed. Like, why is this guy kind of looking really agitated and, patting himself all over the place? And it turns out the piccolo ended up way at the bottom of the back of the tail. And his solo's coming up, and he doesn't have time to try to wriggle it all the way back up and through the hole. So his only thought is, I can't mess this up. So he just takes his tail and he rips it open, totally destroying his tails. But he gets the piccolo out just in time, and he puts it up, and he plays this little piccolo solo. And Bernstein's watching the whole thing. And at this point, he's just killing himself laughing. He's figured out what's going on, and he just finds this hilarious. And the poor conductor's struggling to keep conducting as he's laughing, and Patrick has to keep a straight face and do his thing. And the next day he had to go and buy a new set of tails.
That's a great story.
Yeah, the funny thing is, after this, I was at a concert, and another male flute soloist, and I mentioned this to him, and he says, I hate to say it, but I had the same problem.
Oh, shoot.
So if you're a male flutist, do not try that trick.
It does not work, apparently.
Yes, bad things could happen.
Oh my goodness. No, I love it. And I love it that he came in on time. Me, I would have missed my entrance.
Yes, well, or miscounted because that. Oh my goodness, what happened to my piccolo? Yeah.
He knew the score very well.
And good under pressure.
Yeah, right? Oh my gosh. Oh, thanks for taking us down memory lane there. That's a great story.
Oh, thanks. I love stories. It's, one of the things that made me fall in love with music, you just hear all the great stories and funny things that happen in the music world. It's a lot of fun. And it was one thing I love doing when I get together with other musicians. We start sharing stories and, we're all laughing, like crazy.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, I can see like the stories, especially after festivals when you go out to celebrate, at dinners and stuff like that. It's like, those stories get passed down and it's great times.
Yeah, absolutely. And things go wrong in concerts. And I think at the end of it, when you're in the middle of it, you have to keep serious. You find solutions. But afterwards, sometimes, having a good laugh about it is a good way. You learn from it, but it's also you have to stay positive. And that's I think, an important thing for keeping your passion going.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of a little bit of my fault of diverting the conversation, but I just had to plug that story in from you because it was a must for me. So going back on topic and talking about your compositions, speaking of telling stories, you do such a great job of telling stories in your pieces. So could you share with the listeners your compositions for flute? Because a lot of times us flutists are always looking for new repertoire to put on the stand and to play for the next concert or recital. And I would love for flutists to be able to access your music.
Well, thank you. As you already know, I love the flute, so I've written several works for flute. The first I'd like to share is called Short Stories. And this was written for my Aunt Louise. And we got to do a CD project together called The Hollywood Flute of Louise DiTullio. And it's a wonderful project where her idea was that she wanted to create concert versions of some of her favorite flute solos that were written for her by the great film composers during her career. And when you've done 1,200 films, it was really tough trying to narrow it down to one CD. But we did it, and for me to be able to do this project with my aunt was very special. So it was great. So on this album, and if you're interested, it's on YouTube, on Spotify, it's iTunes, it's all the major platforms. But you can go and listen to it. Just The Hollywood Flute of Louise DiTullio, and she asked me to write her a group of 4 pieces. And because as a studio flute player, she regularly has to double, and so she regularly used the flute, the piccolo, the alto flute, the bass flute. And as we know, there's a lot of really great contemporary music for these instruments, but less so for kind of a more tonal, more accessible music, so to speak. And so she wanted me to write 4 pieces kind of in a film music type of style, like really concert encore type pieces. So the first piece is called Siren Song for alto flute, and it's really based on the Hollywood film noir music, those great kind of gangster movies where you have the femme fatale, and so the alto flute with, it's kind of a sexy sound. So this movement, it's about kind of the alto flute seducing, the hero, and So this was that was a lot of fun. And then the second movement is called Rather Blue for bass flute, and Louise used to work a lot for Henry Mancini, and I also had the opportunity to work with Hank, both in the studio and in concert stage. And he loved writing for bass flute. So I thought, okay, well, this movement starts off kind of bluesy and then goes into kind of a section that sounds like it's kind of improvised, though it's written out. And so Louise does some jazz bass flute playing. So again, that was another interesting one. And then the third movement is the Chased, and that's written just for the regular flute. And it's it's like a chase scene in a movie. And so the flute keeps busy in that movement to have some, this kind of energetic chase music. And then the fourth movement is called Child's Play for piccolo. And Louise specifically said, well, so often the piccolo is used in a very virtuosic manner. So I want to also show that the piccolo can be played melodically. And so she wanted that part of that movement. And so I said, sure. So I came up with this kind of childlike melody that, could show off the melodic aspect of the piccolo. And then, of course, the child gets to run and play too. So you have a combination of both melodic and some virtuosic writing there. So 4 very different styles of music, and it was originally written for the flutes, a harp, 1 percussion and string orchestra, but also, of course, she had me write a flutes and piano version, and that was actually, that version was premiered at the National Fluke Convention. So that and that's obviously much more often played, the flute and piano version. So if anyone's interested, I publish my own music. You could just contact me directly at ronaldroyer.com.
Nice. Yeah.
And I'm always thankful for any performance of my music. It's to me, it's a special thing. So that's the first piece. Do you want me to share a few more?
Yeah, that'd be great. I do find that your music is very communicative and very appealing. And so, yeah, share away.
Well, thank you. And again, I think that's because I was brought up as a cellist, and as a player, we want to connect with our audience. We want to entertain, we want to touch and move, and so that's very important for me as a composer. So the next piece is called Fantasy Impromptu. And this is for flute and string orchestra, but again, a version for flute and piano. And this is based on Chopin's Impromptu in G-flat minor, Opus 51, number 3. And this was part of a project. At the time, I was composer in residence with the Toronto Sinfonietta, and they received a lot of support from the Polish-Canadian Society of Music. And so in 1999 was the 150th anniversary of Chopin's death. And, Chopin's, is very highly respected in Polish culture. And so they want to do something special. They want to do a special concert, and they wanted to do a recording project. And so they said, well, the reality is, there's lots of great recordings of Chopin's piano concertos and works for piano and orchestra. So, let's do something different. And we sat down and talked about it, and we decided we would do new arrangements for some of Chopin's either piano or chamber music works. And then we would do some, myself and another composer, Alexander Rappaport, we would write original pieces inspired by the music of Chopin. So for this project, I arranged Chopin's variations on a theme of Rossini for flute and string orchestra. and we recorded this. And also it was a tough choice, but it didn't make it on the album. But I also did a nocturne in B major, Opus 32, number 1, again arranged for flute and string orchestra. So it was really great arranging these works. And then I wrote the Fantasy Impromptu, inspired by Chopin, and I kept parts of the melody, but I changed the rhythm and changed the harmony and kept kind of that romantic spirit, but also gave it a more contemporary sound. And it was a lot of fun, really digging into the music of Chopin and trying to find ways to be, showcase his legacy and his continued influence, because he was such a great composer and especially harmonically did such interesting things, of showing that he still has relevance on contemporary composers.
Wow. Yeah, you keep busy, Ron. Because just looking at your website, I mean, your catalog of works that you've composed is endless. I mean, you have everything: chamber music, chamber orchestra, music for film, theater, holiday arrangements, and the list goes on and on. So we thank you for your output.
Well, I love music. So to me, it's not work.
Yeah.
So I felt very fortunate in my career that everything I've done, I've really enjoyed. I've really enjoyed the work. And for composing, it's a passion. And I just love to compose, and I'm thankful that people want to commission me and to record my music and to perform it. And every opportunity is special to me.
Yeah, you can tell that you really do enjoy the work. So that's a nice breath of fresh air.
And I'd like to mention too for people that, to be honest, I always thought about composing when I was younger, but I didn't think I had the ability to be a composer. And occasionally too, when I mentioned to friends or even my own parents, who were very supportive of me, and say, I'm kind of thinking about this, and they say, you're a cellist, you're busy with school, you don't have time for that, and I think I wasn't ready for it, and it just was something. It just kind of grew in me, and by the time I hit 30, I just realized this. At this point, it says I don't care if I'm any good or not. It's an experience I need to have in my life, and I just did it, and with no expectations, and I started to compose, and then. Because I already had a degree from the University of Toronto, when I moved to Canada, I did a master's degree in performance. And so I started composing, and when I started to teach, and I really fell in love with it. And I said, for me, I really want the structure of a program. Some composers are self-taught, but for me, I wanted that structure, and working with, really expert composers. And the University of Toronto has a great program and still does. And so I applied, and and they looked at my transcripts and said, well, you should apply for the graduate program. When I wasn't sure, because I had very little experience as a composer. Anyway, I applied. They turned me down. They said, look at we don't recommend you do this. I said, look at you're 30, you're a teacher, you're a cellist. If you want to do more work, go into those areas. But, we don't recommend this. And, if that had happened when I was 16, that I would have been devastated by it. But at that point, I said, well, I'm not really concerned about trying to make a living. I'm not concerned about, this is something I need to do. And so they basically said, well, you have the right to take some undergraduate courses because you are, officially a student and you did a degree. And, if that's, so I did. As I went back, and for 2 years while I was teaching, I took undergraduate courses. I studied a whole year of counterpoint, which is this, your basic technique of being a composer is based on counterpoint. And then I took a 4th year composition course. And over those 2 years, I really worked hard to build my skills. So then I applied again after that and got in for a master's degree, did my master's degree, and then applied for my doctorate degree and got in. But I ended up getting a job at the University of Toronto Schools, which is a school for gifted students at the University of Toronto, a very special place as part of the university. And it was such a great job. The doctorate degree never happened, but I was thankful for the job. But the point is at a certain point, you have to have courage and don't be frustrated if people say, no, you can't do it. You don't have the talent. Really, at the end of the day, it's about a lot of hard work. And if you really want it bad enough, you put in the work, you find the best teachers you could get, you work hard and let your passion take you from there. And I've seen that happen so often with players or composers, and I'm sure you're the same thing, is if, someone really has the passion and really wants to find a way to do things in music, they get there.
Yeah. What great advice for all of us, whether you are an aspiring composer or educator or performer, that can be applied to any niche within our music community. So I respect that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So cool. So is there anything else that you want to dive into? You mentioned about studio recordings and counting the albums on your website. I counted, I believe, 20 different albums that you were a part of in some capacity. Is that correct?
Well, there's 16 to date of CDs that my music is on. And then, of course, as a cellist, that's many more. When I worked in the studios, there's a number of soundtrack recordings as well. So I've had a lot of experience from different perspectives as a cellist in Los Angeles, recording chamber music, recording my own music. And also I've produced some albums. So I love the recording process. There's something very exciting about creating a recording that has a shelf life. So you say live concerts are so fantastic, but they come and they go. But with the recording, they stick around. And that's something very special to have that document.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I bring up the recordings because is there any advice that you can give to a aspiring studio musician who wants to record his or her own music or others' music? Because that's just a different world to be in the studio, right? And I just wanted to pick your brain there, if you don't mind.
No, absolutely.
Okay, to offer anything that you'd like.
Well, I think the first step is talk to someone who has experience, because that's really important. I mean, go online. I mean, there's so many great resources online, but also talk to someone who has experience, because it'll save you a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of headache, because it's very easy to make mistakes when you're doing it from scratch. So that's kind of my first advice. But with recording, you need to look at it holistically. So, the first step is, why are you doing the recording? What are your goals with it? Because there's the process of making the recording, and there's also the process of releasing and marketing the recording. And depending on who you're marketing to and what kind of audience you're trying to attract, do you want to get radio played? Do you want to get reviewed? All those type of things are considerations, and that'll affect the repertoire that you choose. So, for example, if you're a flute player and you're a young flute player and you want to do a recording to help promote your career, and I recommend that. But something to consider is, when you're doing your album, do at least something new on your album. Because if you do a really standard piece like Prokofiev Flute Sonata, well, there's a lot of recordings. If it's going to be hard to get recognized, especially if you're just up and coming. And also, you're going to be compared to every great recording of that piece that's ever been. But if you record a piece that's never been recorded before, you are now the expert. You're the first recording, and you're going to be the measure that everyone else is going to be measured against. If this piece gets played again, if people are going to play it, record it, you are the expert. And it's a really good way of approaching it too with reviewers, because now they don't have anything to compare. So they're going to talk about, here's this new piece, and they're going to talk about the piece, and so it's frankly much easier to get a really positive review doing new music. So it's something to consider.
No, that's perfect. I love it. And that makes me think of a time when I was performing in Greece, and I wanted to bring a part of my American background to Greece, hoping that, they hadn't heard some of the music from, the Americas. And I chose one of the pieces to play at the Archaeological Museum in Thessaloniki, Greece, a piece by my friend, William Blackhorse. And it had a lot of Native American themes in it and elements to that degree. And it was received really well. And later, when people were commenting on the performance and thanking me for my time, that was like the first piece that would be talked about because it was something new to their ears. And so, yeah, you're dead on the money. You're definitely right. It rings different.
Yeah, and it's exciting. And I think a lot of audiences, they like what they know, but then you also introduce something new. Mm-hmm. And so, to be able to play more traditional flute repertoire and some new repertoire, to me, it's a really great combo. And it's also what I grew up with my family. They would always play more traditional fare, but they were also always doing contemporary music as well, and had a number of pieces composed for their trio. And for example, I don't know if most people realize, but John Williams wrote earlier in his career a flute concerto, but it's based on serial techniques. And Louise didn't do the premiere of it, but she actually performed that several times in the version for flute and piano. And my mother, the two of them played it together, and they actually performed it on the radio. And John Williams actually sent, which I own, a really lovely letter to my mother thanking her for performing this music and complimenting her and Louise on their wonderful performance. But it's really an interesting piece, and it's not your usual John Williams, but a very effective piece in that style of that 12-tone technique music. I think it's just those flute concerto.
Okay.
I'm not totally sure. It's been a lot of years since I've heard it, and I would love to hear it again. But
you're right. It's just John Williams's flute concerto.
Yeah, I mean, and John is such an amazing composer, and it was so exciting to have him part of the Hollywood Flute Project. And he was, Louise has worked for him for over 40 years, and has so much respect for him as a composer, and really loves working with him. And it was really great that he was supportive of the project. Amazing composer, both his film music and his concert music. Really an amazing American composer.
I feel like I should know that piece, but I didn't. So now I will definitely have to check it out.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, it's really exciting that in more contemporary times, there's been so much great music written for the flute or the other instruments in the flute family. And I know myself, I've been thankful for the flute works that I've composed.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, Ron. And we so appreciate your contribution to the flute world. It's great to see all of your hard work come to fruition. And I wish you all the success in the world on top of all of your successes that you already have, but even more to come for you, and many blessings.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. And you too.
Oh, thank you. So in the last portion of the show, I do a fun segment called Picks. Do you have a pick for the listener today?
Yes. I would like to share a couple of my movies. I have to admit, I'm a little weird in the fact that I choose my movie favorites on the film scores. If the film has a great score, then I love the film. So some of my favorite film scores that have wonderful flute solos. And these are all film scores that Louise did. One, Dances with Wolves, starring Kevin Costner. Beautiful flute solos throughout the score by John Barry. Was famous for writing music for James Bond films, but he could also write beautiful melodic music. Another great John Barry score, Out of Africa. Again, beautiful flute solos throughout. The famous movie with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. A John Williams movie that was on our album, but really beautiful flute solos. Hook, starring Robin Williams. And then a movie that came after we did our project, War Horse. Beautiful, beautiful flute solos, and and John Williams wrote flute solos for the different flutes for Louise, and Louise actually got screen credit for that film. But the beginning of the film, I just love it because it starts off with a solo flute, and you have this view of the British countryside, and this aerial shot, and the beautiful video, and just the solo flute, and Louise played it so beautifully, and then the full orchestra comes in, and what a magical way to start a motion picture. Just genius with the music, and then the whole score is amazing. And then another film that's beautiful flute solos is Rudy, and that's by Jerry Goldsmith. And Louise talked to Jerry before he passed away, and Jerry talked about that was one of his all-time film scores. And Jerry Goldsmith did so many he did several of the Star Trek movies and so many big budget big movies. But this smaller film based on a true story, it's got some of the most beautiful flute solos. So anyway, those are 5 films. Anyone who loves the flute, watch those movies, or even just go on YouTube and listen to the music. Fantastic flute solos.
Thanks for those picks. That was a great list.
Oh, you're welcome. And of course, there's so many great flute solos over the years. I think a lot of it was a lot of composers in Hollywood loved Louise's playing. And of course, there's other great flute players too. And so they would write flute solos to feature these wonderful artists. And all of us flute lovers are the better for it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I will take your lead then. And when you were talking about great soundtracks to films, the first thing that came to my mind was the amazing, beautiful soundtrack for the Netflix original series called Anne with an E. If you have not seen the series, the story, of course, is based on Anne of Green Gables. And just the story and the characters, the plot is stunning. The costumes and how everyone came together with the acting and such is phenomenal. And then the glue to all of it, I think, is the wonderful soundtrack. So if you have not checked out that series, I highly recommend it.
Great. I haven't, so I'm going to check it out now.
Oh, Ron, you would love it. You really would. Yeah. Now that I know through these different relationships that we have, I really think that you would just eat it up.
Okay. I have my homework.
Yeah.
I'll report back.
Oh, good. I love reports. Well, thank you so much, Ron, for your time, talents, and expertise. And I'm so glad that you have given us, this time together for you to share your wonderful career and your accomplishments. And thank you so much for everything that you do.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure here. And if any of your listeners want to contact me, just go to my website, ronaldroyer.com, and I'll be happy to respond.
Perfect. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. Please subscribe to the Flute 360 newsletter by going to HeidiKBegay.com. A pop-up will appear and you can enter in your information for the weekly newsletter. The newsletter includes great incentives, updates, and perks to the subscribers. Go ahead to HeidiKBegay.com and sign up today. Thank you.